All right, welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. Ahead of the sentencing of Bryan Kohberger after pleading guilty in the murder of the 4 University of Idaho students. Still, many people are asking what happened that fateful night in Moscow, Idaho, including the President of the United States, as he posted this on social media saying Bryan Kohberger was responsible in Idaho for the deaths of those 4 wonderful young souls, has made a plea bargain in order to avoid the death penalty. These were vicious murders with so many questions left unanswered. While life imprisonment is tough, it's certainly better than receiving the death penalty. But before sentencing, I hope the judge makes Kohberger at minimum explain why he did these horrible murders. There's no explanations. There is nothing. People should be shocked as they were able to plea bargain, but the judge should make him explain exactly what happened. And I think a lot of people agree, or at least share that same sentiment. We're going to be joined right now by a legal analyst, friend of the program, Jacqueline Goodman. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Does the president have a point, and is there any possibility that the judge makes Kohberger explain why that happened?
Both sides of this issue probably would agree with some of what we're hearing from Donald Trump. The idea that someone doesn't get a right to have their trial is something that has plagued the community in the criminal defense world for quite a long time. We have a disappearing right to a trial. Very, very few cases, about 2% of all felony cases, 1% of misdemeanor charges ever get to a jury. And so with that is lost all the truth and all the sanitizing that comes out in those trials. We don't get to hear about police misconduct, for example, and other issues that might go to the real truth of whether a person is guilty or innocent of those charges. And so both sides lament that vanishing right to a trial, and the potential for a much more serious sentence goes along with, in some ways, sort of a tool of coercion for a plea. Nevertheless, the question that the president raises about wanting to know about the motive for this killing, I think does really speak to the hearts of people that have been following this case for a long time. Why did he do it if he did it? What was going on in his mind? Because it's really hard to put together, and that's understandable. Yep. But I think that the prosecution and some of the families of the victims really understand that to ask that question, to put that out there, is to serve no purpose really other than public spectacle. And so I think that there's a reason why there's a split of opinion about what the president is saying. Plus, it's generally not a great idea for someone with the bully pulpit to come out and speak on particular cases. And so, some view that as an encroachment on the independence of the judiciary. And that's why you rarely hear a president speak on it. But no surprise, this is a case that's been in the headlines. And, it's something that really does speak to the heart of people that are watching it. It really is a difficult thing to think about. And I understand why people are emotional about it.
Yeah, it's such a high-profile case that it raised to the level of President Trump paying attention. And like you mentioned, no motive would be satisfactory for a lot of these families in the killing of those students. We talked about some of the plea deal and the lack thereof in terms of conditions. Is that normal to have some sort of conditions like they were in place for this Kohberger trial case?
Sometimes it really depends a lot on where you're practicing, what jurisdiction we're talking about. But typically there are things that are talked about before the case gets to the final agreement. These are negotiations that go on from the inception. So when you see some of the sort of, I don't want to say loose ends, but when there's really no major concessions on either side and it's a plea with an understanding of what the sentence is likely to be because there's not much else you can do, those are what we refer to as open pleas. Sometimes they take something like the death penalty off the table, but there's no other conditions to that. And that's not at all unusual in a case like this.
And of course, sentencing coming up here on Wednesday, expected to receive 4 consecutive life terms with no chance of parole, plus another 10 years. Walk us through it. What are the mechanisms? What happens on Wednesday?
So on Wednesday, he's going to be officially sentenced. That's when the judge is going to pronounce sentence, and that's really the end of the jurisdiction of that trial court. Notably, he has waived his right to appeal, but some legal scholars have said that you really cannot waive your right to appeal, and so you can still appeal that decision. But in any event, he will be sentenced. The family of the victims in this case will have an opportunity to speak and to be heard, but realistically, they're not likely to affect whether this plea goes forward the way we're anticipating that it will. So it's really this right to allocution, this right to get it off their chest, but it doesn't really have much effect on whether the sentence would be what we're anticipating or whether the plea deal will go down. It's an extraordinarily rare time when a judge changes course based on the statements from the families of the victims in a case like this.
We're expecting all sorts of emotions from those victim statements of family members, anger, sadness, just obviously exhaustion with all of this proceeding. And some of the families were pleased with the plea deal. Others were disappointed that it potentially did not get the death penalty. In terms of those victim statements, do they have to run it by the court at all? How does that happen?
They really don't have to. I mean, the judge is the one who decides the running of the court. In a particular courtroom, a judge may require it. But under the law, they don't have to see these statements before they get up and give them to the court. Sometimes you'll see a court try to stop a victim from saying things directly to a defendant. Sometimes there's so much drama, as you can imagine, there's so much emotion. It is all of the human drama laid out before you. And so there can be times where the court might stop someone and ask them to, direct their attention to the court and to speak their mind, but they may sometimes be asked to keep the decorum in the courtroom. Listen, the plea is itself an attempt in some ways to spare these victims of the trauma of having to live through this trial, the uncertainty of the outcome of any trial. And so, we keep in mind, the court and the district attorney, the feelings and the righteous feelings of these victims. And so it is, in a sense, their day to get some things off their chest. And, the court is going to be very deferential to those folks.
And I want to ask you, because during that term when we saw the case and the plea deal being put forward, we heard Bryan Kohberger say, yes, he did kill these 4 individuals, these 4 University of Idaho students. It was really the first time some of the details came out. Are we expecting more details, some of information that the family was privy to that the public wasn't? Are we going to learn more information about what happened that night during those victim statements?
The family did have more information, I think, than the press did. Not very much more. They've been somewhat public about indicating that they, some of them don't really want to know anymore, but they've said that there is a little bit more that they know, but not much more. And so I do think that they're likely to reference those things in their statements. And so I think the public might, when they're watching, be made aware of additional facts. But things like motive, I don't believe have been indicated in any of the discovery. And so I don't think that there's any facts that the family is going to be privy to and disclose at these statements. But they have no, there's very little limitation on what these families can say. And they rarely are told what not to say. They're just there to get their feelings off their chest and to make their feelings known to the court and to the defendant at this time. And so it's their day, and we may be, no surprise, we're going to learn surprises. Yeah. But I don't think that there's much other information concerning the motive that people are wanting to know that is going to be disclosed at that hearing.
The finer details that were taken during discovery. So it'll be interesting for that. I do want to ask you, because we've seen some of the family members come out. They've interviewed with different media outlets. And of course, one of the conversations was about Bryan Kohberger saying the names of the victims. During the plea deal, he just said, yes, I did kill these 4 individuals. Is that something that could potentially be on the table? Any vocalization from Bryan Kohberger about saying their names, or is that not something that's common?
I doubt it. I understand that they want that. It's a bit of a unique request, and I understand why they want that. But I doubt that there's going to be any kind of requirement of a defendant to say anything at all on that day. Typically, often defendants say nothing. And if they want to, they can make a statement. Sometimes they apologize. Sometimes they speak to the court. And that's going to be, interesting in this case to see whether Bryan Kohberger puts anything in his own words about his relationship to these people, if any, and what was motivating him on that fateful day. We don't expect to hear much from a defendant, but, look, it's a very high profile case. Folks are, no one really knows. The defendant is going to be able to speak there as respects his own right to allocution, and it's going to be whatever is in his mind. He may do those things, but he's never going to be required to speak the names of the victims.
So he will be able to speak. Are we expecting to hear Bryan Kohberger speak on Wednesday?
I'm not. He can. He has a right to allocution. But most of the time, the defendant will not speak at that time and be sentenced. You know, it's the victims that are likely to be heard from on that day, and probably not Bryan Kohberger. And I would imagine that his lawyers would be advising him not to speak, but ultimately it's his decision.
And let's say this happens and he's given these 4 life sentences, which we all expect, plus those 10 years. Is Bryan Kohberger going to be shackled up, led away, led off to prison, and never heard from again? What happens after sentencing?
He has waived his right to appeal. And that's an interesting question about whether that waiver is valid, whether you can sort of pierce that waiver, whether you can argue that the giving of the waiver to appeal itself was coerced and therefore invalid. And you can go to the Court of Appeal. You can petition in direct appeals and habeas corpus. You can sometimes go beyond those appeals. And so I would anticipate that we would at some point hear from Bryan Kohberger, if not sooner than later, but I do expect that we would hear from him, and we may learn lots about this case in the coming days and weeks and months and years in the review process.
And that's some of the parents' point, is that this Bryan Kohberger will obviously be behind bars, but he will continue to live his life, unlike those 4 University of Idaho students. Jacqueline, anything else that we're missing? Anything else you want to note before I let you go?
You know, I do think it's remarkable that 2 of the families have come out in support of this plea bargain. I understand that the Goncalves family has expressed their deep disappointment at the result, but the families are not all monolithic in their view of what is happening. And I understand that to some, this is really a closure. And I think that you're going to see that this is going to leave the front pages anymore. And it really is going to be that even if Bryan Kohberger is, quote unquote, speaking out in these filings that he may have in the future, really, I think that this is going to be a closure, a marking of the end of this case for everyone involved.
Yeah, like you mentioned, obviously the victim statements, but those victims silenced forever. So it's very sad to see. We'll see what happens during sentencing. Obviously expected those 4 life sentences and 10 years additionally. All right, Jacqueline, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight here on Live Now.
Great to be here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great conversation there as always. And we'll take you out to this hearing taking place on Wednesday there in Idaho. We've been profiling it very closely for quite some time since those graphic murders at the University of Idaho. I'm Eddie Mack. We're back after this.